Welcome, my friends, to tonight's journey into a world that is as raw, unforgiving, and utterly alien to modern life as it is endlessly fascinating. Before we set sail into the dark, icy waters of the Viking Age, I want to ask you for a small favor. If you enjoy stories that transport you across centuries, that let you feel the wind in your hair and the salt on your lips, then please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you can imagine. And it tells me you want more journeys like this one. Now, I want to know something from you. From where are you watching this? Is it a bustling city where neon lights hide the stars? Or is it somewhere quiet, where the night is dark and the silence deep? Tell me in the comments your corner of the world is part of this story too. And now, let us begin. Picture a horizon that is nothing but sea and sky, the line between them blurred by low gray clouds that seem to press down on the earth. The air smells of brine and something sharper, like iron. And beneath your feet is not the comfort of solid ground, but the slick, heaving deck of a longship. The oars groan in their locks as men pull in unison, their breath steaming in the cold, their hands hard and calloused from years of gripping wood and rope. You are a guest here, or perhaps a captive, it's hard to tell. Either way, you have stepped into a society that exists on the knife's edge of survival, a place where every hour demands strength, cunning, and the willingness to do violence when necessary. The Vikings, you will discover, are not the horn-helmeted caricatures from cartoons. They are flesh and blood, and they do not see the world as you do. Their lives are shaped by forces most of us will never face. Winters that can kill, seas that can swallow a man in seconds, and enemies that will take everything if you falter for even a moment. The day begins before dawn. There is no luxury of slow waking, no warm coffee or gentle light creeping through curtains. Instead, the cold bites at your face as you are shaken from sleep, your body aching from the hard planks you lay upon. Around you, men are already moving, fastening leather straps, checking weapons, muttering in a language that sounds like the grinding of stone. If you are lucky, you might be handed a piece of bread, dense and sour, or a chunk of dried fish so tough you must chew it for minutes before it softens. This is not a meal for pleasure, it is fuel and nothing more. You will soon learn that in the Viking world, eating is not about taste, but survival. And survival means conserving energy for what the day will demand. If you are on land, the morning may begin with tending to livestock, repairing tools, or readying the boat for another raid. If at sea, it is the relentless rhythm of rowing, the constant wetness of spray on your skin, and the unending vigilance for changes in the wind or the sky. The seas these men cross are not forgiving, the waves are not polite. A storm can rise in minutes, and when it does, there is no safe harbor to run to, only the hope that your strength and your ship will be enough to carry you through. But the dangers are not only in the natural world. The Vikings are warriors, and warriors make enemies. You may find yourself approaching a foreign shore before sunrise, the ship's prow cutting silently through the mist. There is no time to think, only to act. You follow the others as they leap into the shallow surf, swords and axes ready, their eyes alight with a mix of anticipation and calculation. For them, violence is not shocking, it is as much a part of life as eating or breathing. For you, the modern outsider, it will be the moment you realize that here, hesitation can mean death. The people they raid may be armed or unarmed, but pity is not a currency the Vikings trade in. They fight to win, and they win to live. And yet, you will also see that their lives are not all blood and steel. There are moments, rare and fleeting, when the oars rest, when the shore is safe, when the fire burns hot in the longhouse, and the air is filled with laughter and song. But even then, there is an undercurrent of danger. Every man in that hall knows that peace is only the pause between battles, that tomorrow the sea may call again, or an enemy may come knocking. You, unaccustomed to the constant awareness of threat, will feel it as a weight in your chest, a tightness that never quite leaves you. This is why you would not last a day here, not because you are weak, but because the Viking world leaves no space for comfort, no time for hesitation, and no mercy for those who cannot match its pace. Even the simplest tasks, fetching water, mending clothing, keeping watch at night, are done with an intensity born of necessity. And, as the day wears on, and the cold deepens, and the horizon darkens with the promise of another storm, you will begin to understand. In the Viking Age, every breath is earned, and every sunrise is a vice's Tory. The longship does not wait for you to adjust. Its timbers creak like an old predator's bones, flexing with each wave, yet somehow holding together under the strain. The men around you are not dressed in shining armor, but in layered wool, leather, and furs, clothes stiff from salt and stained from years of hard living. Their eyes are sharp, pale like ice, and they scan the horizon with a focus that tells you this is no sightseeing voyage. You grip the side of the ship to steady yourself, your knuckles whitening, but the Vikings do not glance at your discomfort. You are expected to endure as they do. The air itself is a weapon here. The cold wind slices through your clothes, the salt stings your lips, and the damp seeps into your bones until you no longer feel warm, only less cold than moments before. You try to breathe deep, but the air is thick with the mingled smells of wet wood, unwashed bodies, and dried fish. It is not pleasant, but in the Viking world, you do not complain, you adapt, or you are left behind. When land appears, it is not the gentle curve of a sandy beach. It is jagged rock, dark forest, or the shadow of a distant settlement. The approach is silent, deliberate. These men know every creak of their ship, every splash of the oars, and they move like wolves closing in on prey. You may think this is the moment for fear, but fear is not part of their calculation. They have measured the risks long before you ever saw the shore. As the keel scrapes the shallows, they leap out with the speed of men who have done this countless times. Your feet sink into icy water that bites like teeth, your breath catching as you stumble after them. The weight of the weapons they hand you is not symbolic. They expect you to use them. The raid is swift and brutal. The target might be a coastal farmstead, its people still half asleep, or a small monastery whose bell tolls frantically as the Vikings approach. You hear shouts, screams, the clang of steel on steel, and the dull thud of axes meeting wood. The Vikings do not linger, they take what can be carried, and destroy what cannot. Fire blooms behind you, casting a sickly orange light on the fog as you run back toward the ship. You are shaken, heart-pounding, but the men are calm, their breathing steady. They speak little, only to give orders or warn of pursuit. In their eyes, this is not cruelty for cruelty's sake, it is survival. The wealth they take will feed their families, repair their ships, buy their freedom from hunger when the seas freeze. Back on the water, the tension does not ease. The wind shifts, the waves grow higher, and the rowers dig in with renewed effort. You quickly learn that storms here are not distant things you watch from shore. They are living beasts that descend upon you with no warning. The sky darkens, the air smells of rain, and the sea begins to rise under you, lifting and dropping the ship like a child's toy. The Vikings tie down everything that can move, shout over the roar of the wind, and adjust the sail in a practice dance. You cling to the side, cold water slapping your face, each wave threatening to throw you overboard. But to these men, this is just another day. They do not fear the storm, they respect it, and they work with it, coaxing the ship through like horsemen guiding a wild beast. Hours pass before the wind finally dies and the sea smooths again. Exhausted, soaked, and shivering. You imagine that now there will be rest. But there is no rest. The Vikings immediately set about repairing what the storm damaged, bailing water from the hull, checking the sail for tears. Some of them even laugh, swapping stories of past voyages where the seas had been worse. To you, the ordeal feels like barely surviving. To them, it is simply living. When night falls, the ship does not anchor. It drifts, guarded by men who take turns keeping watch. You are assigned a place to sit, wedged between two warriors whose heavy cloaks smell of smoke and salt. They offer you a share of dried meat, hard as stone, and expect you to chew it without complaint. Sleep comes in short bursts, interrupted by the slap of waves or the barked orders of the watch. Every sound in the darkness could be a threat. Another ship, a sudden squall, or the crack of ice forming on the water. In the Viking world, you do not sleep deeply, you cannot afford to. And even if you could, the cold would not let you. Your body aches, your stomach churns from the constant motion, and your mind reels from the violence you've witnessed. You realize, slowly and with growing dread, that this is only the first day. The Vikings live like this not for a week or a season, but for years. Their lives a cycle of preparation, travel, battle, and survival. There is no comfort here, no safe harbor for the weak. This is why you would not last a day, not because you lack courage, but because the demands of this life are relentless, stripping away every softness until only the hard and the sharp remain, and you are not yet sharp enough. By midday, the cold has worked its way into your bones so thoroughly that your hands shake even when you try to hold them still, and that is when you learn that weakness has a cost here, because the Viking world does not pause for your comfort. It demands payment in sweat, blood, and attention, and every lapse is tallied by wind and wave and the eyes of men who have buried too many friends to tolerate carelessness any longer. They hand you a bailer, and you begin scooping icy water from the hull, while the steersman calls the wind like a priest calling the dead, nudging the long keel through a field of gray chop with a touch that looks easy, until you see how often death misses the ship by the width of a palm. And you begin to understand why these people make oaths with such gravity, why their word is iron, and their anger slow but lethal. Because the world around them is merciless, and only merciless promises hold it back. When you finally make landfall on a narrow strip of beach hemmed by dark spruce and stone, there is no feast waiting, only tasks you did not know existed until now. Someone thrusts a bronze-edged knife into your hand and points toward driftwood. Another ties a net across a gully to slow the run of startled sheep. Another treads a circle into wet sand and reminds you in a flat voice that the shore may belong to someone who believes steel is a better argument than talk. You swallow a mouthful of air that tastes of kelp and smoke and set to work, because not working is a kind of treason here, not against a king or a law, but against the thin thread of survival that binds the boat crew into something like a family. You think you know hunger because you skipped meals back home from meetings and deadlines? But hunger here is not a sensation. It is a presence that sits beside you while you slice dried cod, that watches while you choke down barley porridge threaded with seal fat, that presses on your chest at night and tells you in a steady voice that if the wind turns and the sea rises, this camp will be swept flat and your name carried away like foam. The men do not complain, they practice gratitude like craft, thanking the animal with a touch, the sea with a glance, the knife with a whetstone, knowing that everything that keeps them alive needs tending, or it stops being loyal. You watch how they move, and it is never without purpose. A warrior's fingers slide down an axe-haft feeling for splinters. A woman mends a sail with bone needles and spun wool, while her toddler plays with a smooth white stone polished by the tide. A youth practices the drill of shield and spear in a rhythm that convinces you the drill matters as much as the fight, because the fight lasts a minute, and the drill lasts a lifetime. You notice the smell, and it is not filth. It is the catalog of a life lived too close to the elements to pretend otherwise. Tar and wet leather, smoke and sweat, alder ash and whale oil, the iron tang of blood, and the clean knife edge of pine sap. None of it masked or denied, because here, honesty is not a virtue. It is a tool. And when a man says a storm is coming, you do not ask how he knows. You tighten your cloak and trust the nose that has been salted by 100 squalls. Later, you are taken inland along a deer track that is a road only because feet have agreed to call it one. The earth is a mat of roots that trips you when you lift your knees like a city walker, and the men laugh once, not cruelly, then show you the low, spare gait that eats distance without wasting breath, and you copy it and discover that these people move with the logic of water, taking the shape of difficulty until difficulty gives up its shape. The settlement you reach is not a row of huts, but a machine built of kinship and craft. Longhouses crouched like animals, roofs thatched with turf split from the moor, door lintels carved with knotwork that says, "We were here, and we will be here again." Smoke slipping from smoke holes and drifting across yards where sheep huddle and a black pot hangs over a bed of coals that never quite dies, tended like a child because warmth and flame are the first gods and the last. Inside is the kind of heat that lifts the fog from your lungs and replaces it with something older. Benches piled with skins, a central hearth where the stew speaks in small bubbles, iron fittings that look hammered yesterday and 1,000 years ago in the same blow, and people who do not raise their voices because loudness is a waste unless it is needed. You sit and a wooden bowl is pushed into your hands, the broth, greasy and glorious, and for a heartbeat, you mistake relief for safety. That is, when the laws of this place make themselves known, not as parchment read by a clerk, but as a map of expectations that everyone knows by heart. Hospitality is sacred and thus heavy. You eat what is given and you give back what you can. A story, or a repair, or a strong back for a day. Because guests re-honored and burdensome in the same breath, and to fail the balance is to bring shame that lives longer than you do. You learn there are fines for insults, and payments for wounds, and oaths that can be sworn on a ring that the chieftain keeps wrapped in cloth like a relic. And you learn there is no lord to run to when your temper breaks. There is only your name, your kin, your word, and the price scale of a man's body, measured in silver, that clinks like fate when brought to a settlement meeting on the windswept ridge the people call the thing. You stand at that thing and feel the cold crawl under your clothes, while cases are argued with clarity that cuts. A dispute over pasture solved by witnesses whose eyes are older than the stones. A blood debt commuted to silver because 2 winters of raiding have thinned the men too much to waste another. A widow claiming the right to a share of a boat because her hands stitched the sail, and the law of this coast knows that labor has lineage. It is brutal and intelligent and uninterested in your feelings. And you realize why sagas recite genealogies like spells? Because in a world without bureaucracy, your father's name and your grandmother's knife and your dead brother's shield are the paperwork that stands between you and nothing. The day does not forgive softness. A thrall drags driftwood up the beach until his knees fail, and nobody flinches because the thrall is property, and the word property here is not a metaphor. It is a chain made of the moments when mercy would have killed a household in winter, and you want to say something and you do not, because your voice has no weight in a hall where everyone has had to choose between hard bread and no bread. Later, you watch a freedman buy back his oath with silver stacked like small moons, and the hall murmurs approval, because freedom here is not a speech in a square. It is a ledger you balance with scars and goods and service. And when you pay it clean, the world agrees to call you a man again. Try the work yourself. Swing an axe into a knotty pine where the grain twists like rope and feels like iron. Feel how the shock rides your arms to your teeth. Feel how 3 strokes done wrong steal an hour of strength you will need at night when the wolves nose at the sheep fence. Stand in a field of barley that looks generous until you place your palms into it and understand each spear of grain is a promise that must be kept by scythe and drying and storage and guarding. And if the rain comes hard for 5 days, every promise rots. And something in you that thought food simply exists dies, and something that knows food is a negotiation is born. Pull a net at dawn with fingers numb to bone and learn how the sea can be empty in a way that feels like insult, then explode with a bitter joy when the mesh comes up alive with herring that flash like coins. A haul that means boots for the little boy with the cough, and a bead for the woman who set your broken splint, and perhaps 2 weeks where nobody has to decide which goat does not get hay. If you think religion will offer rest, you misunderstand these gods. The carver's hands show you a figure of a one-eyed traveler whose gaze makes the hair on your arms rise, And you are told wisdom is paid in pain, and magic is paid in isolation, and that a god can love you the way a storm teaches respect. A woman on the headland mutters over a bowl of water that mirrors the sky, and the men give her space because satyr is dangerous, not because it is wicked, but because it works. And you feel a tightness in your chest that is not fear exactly, but the sensation of being noticed by the land itself. On another night, the skald sings in a voice that carries like a sail, and the hall becomes the inside of a story where every oath turns to iron and every betrayal leaves a stain. And when he names a dead man, you never knew you wipe your face without knowing why. Hygiene is not the cartoon you were taught. There is a comb in every belt, a bath on the 6th day if the water can be spared, steam rising from a stone hut where heat is a hammer, and birch switches slap sweat and old fatigue from skin until your head swims and your thoughts clear like ice after a bright morning. Linen is washed in lye and smoke scrubs the air clean, and a woman's hair smells of juniper oil and wild thyme. And you realize cleanliness is not cosmetic, it is armor against rot and disease, in a climate that would prefer everything returned to earth. Combat here is the continuation of maintenance by other means. Shield rims are bound in rawhide that shrinks tight as truth. Spearheads are ground until they bite like arguments. And boys learn the measure of distance not by paces, but by the time it takes a thrown axe to arrive. You stand in a ring of trampled grass, while two men demonstrate why formations matter more than fury. How a wall of wood and discipline turns a hero into a corpse, and you see why berserkers are terrifying. And also why they are dangerous to their own, because rage is a fire that roars until it runs out of air, and the men here cannot afford anything that burns too hot to control. Evening falls like a lid and you think the work is over, but now comes the accounting that keeps tomorrow possible. Tools are put away in a sequence older than the house, fish are salted in layers that look like geology, arrows are checked one by one, because one cracked shaft can mean a bore in your thigh, and a fever in your blood. Children recite half-remembered god names, like they are counting stars, and the old man in the corner rubs bare fat into a split in the doorpost, because the wind finds every weakness, and so do enemies. Somebody plucks a lyre and a girl sings a melody that sounds like sunlight on water, in a place that has not seen sunlight for days, and the hall breathes as one animal, not relaxed, but satisfied that all the edges have been sharpened as far as they will go today. You will not sleep well, because sleep is not an escape, but a skill, and you have not trained it. Every noise tells a story. The near yip of a fox, the far drum of surf, the creak of the longhouse beams settling with the tide of heat and cold, the cough of the boy you saw at the net, and the small sigh of the woman who braided her hair with bone pins and never once complained when the stew boiled too thin. You think of your bed at home and feel shame that you did not know it was a blessing, and you promise yourself if you live through this night, you will never take a pillow for granted again. Morning is ablaze again, and if you expected a reprieve, you have not been listening. The chieftain declares a voyage, because news has arrived like a raven with wet wings, a cousin slain beyond the cape, a debt unpaid, a winter storehouse burned by hands that did not belong there. The men do not pound the benches or shout, they nod like carpenters measuring a beam, because violence here is not an event, it is a craft, and like all crafts, it is practiced with care and carried out with a seriousness that does not leave room for theater. You are handed a round shield and told to hold it high, and to remember that your death will not be yours alone. It will belong to the line of people who just taught you how to stand on this floor. You think you cannot bear it, and then you do, for an hour, for two, discovering that the body has reserves it never reveals until demand is absolute. Yet even as you endure, you know the deeper truth that these people do not merely survive days like this. They stack them into years and braid them into sagas, and that is why you would not last a day among them. Not because you are weak or soft or unworthy, but because a day here is not 24 hours. It is a contract with cold and sea and steel and kin and hunger and law and song, and every clause must be honored without flinching or excuse. And until you can promise your breath to every line of that contract the way they do when they shove the longship down the shingle and lean into the oars with faces like cliffs, the day will break you, the wind will take what is left, and the story will go on without your name carved anywhere that the salt and the years cannot wash clean. The cold northern wind would hit you first, sharp and unrelenting, carrying with it the salt of the sea and the smoke of distant hearths. A wind that seemed to cut straight through any cloth you wore, no matter how tightly you wrapped yourself. Because the land of the Vikings was not built for comfort but for endurance, and every step you took on their soil would remind you of that fact. The ground itself alternating between frozen, rock-hard earth and deep, sucking mud depending on the season, each equally treacherous in its own way. And before you could even think about fitting in, the sheer physical toll of simply existing there would press upon you, from the heavy, fur-lined garments that weighed on your shoulders to the constant dampness that seeped into your boots, your skin, your bones. The villages you would pass through were small yet bursting with life, timber halls with steep roofs to shed snow, their walls darkened by years of smoke from central hearths that never went out, for the fire was more than warmth here. It was survival itself, and every household guarded it as carefully as they guarded their weapons. Inside these halls, the air was thick with a mixture of scents, both inviting and overwhelming: roasting meat from a recent hunt, the tang of fermented fish that had been curing for months, the sharp bite of ale, and the ever-present musk of damp wool and unwashed bodies. Privacy was almost non-existent. The entire family, and sometimes guests or hired hands, would sleep together in the same long room, their beds little more than wooden frames filled with straw and covered with animal skins. And if you were lucky, you might find a spot near the fire where the warmth could keep the night's chill from settling into your marrow. But warmth came with its own cost. Fleas and lice thrived in these conditions, and it was considered normal to spend long winter evenings plucking them from one another's hair, chatting as casually as if discussing the day's catch. The noise never truly stopped. Children shrieked and played even in the dim light, hounds barked and padded about, warriors drank and argued over past raids, and in the corner, someone was always mending nets, carving wood, or sharpening a blade, because idleness was an enemy here, and every moment was bent toward work or preparation for what might come next. Outside, the landscape stretched wide and unforgiving, a mosaic of deep fjords cutting into jagged mountains, forests so dense they seemed to swallow the light, and open meadows that in summer burst with wildflowers, but in winter became windswept plains of ice and snow, and each of these places carried dangers you were unprepared for, from wolves that hunted the fringes to storms that could roll in from the sea without warning. The Vikings knew how to read the land and sky. They could smell a coming shift in the wind, hear the change in the forest silence that signaled prey or predator, but you would be deaf and blind to these signs, dependent entirely on their guidance, and they would not always have the patience to offer it. For here competence was survival, and incompetence could doom not just yourself but those around you. Then there was the sea, the lifeblood and the terror of their world, and you could not avoid it. Their longships were not merely tools of war, but the veins through which their lives flowed, carrying them to trade, to raid, to explore, and the moment you set foot on one, you would feel the rise and fall beneath you, the icy spray against your face, and the endless horizon ahead, and you would understand that to them the sea was both friend and foe, granting bounty one day and death the next, and yet they faced it without hesitation, because hesitation had no place here. You would also find yourself a stranger in their customs, for the Vikings lived by codes that were as sharp as the steel of their swords. Honor bound every man and woman to defend their kin, to avenge wrongs, to repay debts in kind, and while hospitality to a guest was sacred, so too was the right to challenge an insult with violence, and the line between jest and offense was far thinner than you would expect. The feasts they held could be joyous, overflowing with mead, music, and laughter, but they could also turn in an instant, the same table where you shared bread becoming the stage for a fight to the death over a careless word, and no one would think it strange. Even their celebrations bore the shadow of war. Songs told of battles won and enemies slain, and the drinking horns were often carved with scenes of gods and warriors, reminders that life was short and the afterlife uncertain. Religion here was not a matter of quiet worship, but of living every day with the gods in mind. From Odin, who demanded sacrifice and cunning, to Thor, who protected the common folk with his hammer, to Freya, who could bless with fertility or curse with loss. And rituals to honor them could be as simple as a toast or as grim as the slaughter of animals. Their blood sprinkled on walls and idols, the smell mingling with the ever-present smoke until it became part of the air itself. For you, raised far from such harshness, it would be a world that felt at once thrilling and crushing, a place where your survival would hinge on learning quickly, speaking carefully, and proving your worth in ways you had never imagined. Because in the land of the Vikings, a single day could test your body, your mind, and your spirit more than a lifetime elsewhere, and if you failed, there would be no mercy. For mercy was a luxury this world could not afford. The second challenge you would face, after the sheer physical brutality of the Viking environment, would be the unspoken social web that governed every action, a network of loyalties, rivalries, and obligations so tightly woven that a misstep could seal your fate before you even realize the mistake. In this world, family was more than blood, it was a fortress, a banner under which you lived and died. Every clan had its name, its lineage, and its stories. Tales of ancestors who had braved seas and slain enemies. And you would be expected to know these stories, to speak them with pride, because they were as much a weapon as a sword. But you would not have them. You would be an outsider, a person without a saga, and that absence alone could cast suspicion on your worth. To the Vikings, a stranger's value was proven through deeds, not words, and until you had bled beside them or fed them from your own stores, you would remain on the outside, watched with polite caution at best and open distrust at worst. In their gatherings, you would notice how men spoke in riddles and layered meaning, their boasts and challenges wrapped in metaphor, each phrase a test of wit and courage, and you would stumble over these exchanges, unsure whether you were being invited to laugh or dared to fight. A feast might seem like a safe setting to you, but here it was an arena where reputations rose and fell, where a well-timed jest could elevate you, and a poorly timed insult could doom you. The mead would flow freely, loosening tongues and tempers, and you would find that drunkenness did not blunt their edge, it sharpened it, stripping away civility and laying bare grudges that had been smoldering for months. If two warriors clashed in words, it could escalate to blades within seconds, and the crowd would not stop them. Instead, they would form a circle, watching, judging, measuring who was truly worthy of respect. You, unused to such raw and immediate violence, might hesitate, and in that hesitation, you would be marked as weak, for in their eyes, a man or woman who will not stand for themselves is already defeated. Beyond the hall, the politics of the sea loomed just as large. Viking society thrived on raiding, trading, and exploration, and every voyage was a calculated risk, one that could bring great wealth or leave the crew's bones bleaching on a foreign shore. Ships were not mere transport, they were symbols of power, their prows carved into dragons or serpents to intimidate enemies and spirits alike, and to be chosen for a crew was both an honor and a test. Life aboard was grueling beyond anything you might imagine. You would row for hours on end, your muscles burning, your hands blistered raw, the salt spray stinging your eyes and lips, and there would be no rest until the captain called it. Food was sparse at sea-dried fish, hard bread, and ale to stave off thirst, and every man and woman aboard had their role, from steering to bailing water to keeping watch for reefs, storms, or hostile ships. The sea was a teacher without mercy, and you would learn quickly that the difference between a successful raid and a disaster could be as small as the angle of a sail or the timing of a turn. On land, the dangers were no less sharp. Raiding required not only strength, but speed, the ability to strike before the enemy could rally, and if you were too slow to keep pace, you would be left behind or worse, cut down where you stood. But raiding was not the only path to survival. Many Vikings were traders, traveling far beyond their homeland to bring back silk from the east, silver from the caliphate, spices from lands you had never heard of, and to be part of such a venture demanded cunning as much as courage, for markets could be as treacherous as battlefields. Deals were struck over cups of ale, sealed with oaths to the gods, and a broken promise could mean exile or death. In this society, every relationship was transactional to some degree. Every gift carried an expectation of return, and the balance of honor and obligation was as delicate as a sword's edge. Even the home front was not without its dangers. Farming in Viking lands was a constant struggle against nature's whims, long winters, short summers, poor soil, and sudden storms, and every harvest was a gamble. You would be expected to work from dawn until the last light, plowing, sowing, reaping, repairing fences, and tending animals. And there would be no room for excuses, for if the work was not done, the whole household could face hunger. And hunger here was not a passing discomfort. It was a creeping shadow that could claim the old, the young, and the weak in a single season. Yet even with all this hardship, the Vikings found joy and beauty in their lives, and you would need to learn to see it if you hoped to understand them. The warmth of a hall after days at sea, the taste of fresh bread baked in an earthen oven, the sound of a skald reciting poetry by firelight, the sight of the northern lights dancing above the fjords. These were the treasures they ought to protect, and perhaps in time you might find them worth the cost. But until then, every moment would be a test, and the price of failure was one you could not afford to pay. If you thought the physical strain and the ruthless social code were the worst of it, you would soon discover that the mental weight of living among Vikings in 1580 was perhaps the heaviest burden of all. In their world, the mind was as much a weapon as the axe, and cunning could often achieve what brute strength could not. But to match them in wit required a lifetime of training in their customs, their stories, and their ways of thinking knowledge you would not have. Every decision they made was filtered through the lens of honor, fate, and the will of the gods, a worldview that left little room for the hesitant or the unsure. They believed in omens and portents, in the power of dreams to foretell victory or doom, and if you dismiss such things as superstition, you would risk alienating those whose trust you needed to survive. A raven circling the camp might be a sign to them to delay a voyage, a sudden change in wind direction a message from Odin himself, and if you ignored these signs and urged them forward, you could be blamed for every misfortune that followed. You would also find that leadership here was not inherited. Without challenge, chieftains had to prove themselves constantly, both in battle and in the hall, and their authority rested on their ability to provide for their people. Fail in that, and they could be deposed or even killed, sometimes by those who once pledged loyalty. You would witness alliances shift overnight, friends turning into rivals, rivals becoming uneasy allies. And this constant instability would demand that you remain vigilant, weighing every word you spoke, every promise you made. The Vikings respected those who could hold their own in this dance of power, but they had no patience for those who faltered. Beyond politics, religion permeated every aspect of life. Their gods were not distant, untouchable beings, but active forces in the world, demanding sacrifices, honoring courage, and punishing cowardice. Feasts were dedicated to them, victories attributed to their favor, defeats to their displeasure. Blood offerings, whether from animals or enemies, were seen as a necessary exchange, a way of keeping the balance between the mortal and the divine. As an outsider, you might recoil at the sight of a goat's throat slit over a carved altar, its blood smeared onto sacred stones, but to the Vikings this was an act of devotion, one that bound the community together. Refuse to participate, and you would be marked as an unbeliever, someone the gods might frown upon, and by extension, someone who could bring misfortune to the group. The mental strain would grow heavier still when you realized that privacy here was almost non-existent. Longhouses were shared by multiple families, with sleeping areas separated only by furs or wooden partitions. And every cough, every whispered conversation, Every sigh of discontent could be overheard. Secrets were rare, and gossip spread faster than wildfire in dry grass. If you made a mistake, it would be known before the day ended, and if you showed fear, it would be remembered long after. You would find yourself constantly performing, maintaining an image of strength and competence even when you felt neither, because to let that mask slip could invite challenges from those who sensed weakness. And then there was the ever-present shadow of vengeance. Viking justice was personal. If a wrong was done to you or your kin, you were expected to answer it, not through courts or laws, but through blood. Kill a man's brother, and he would come for you, whether tomorrow or years from now, and his right to do so would be respected. The cycles of feud could last generations, dragging entire families into endless chains of retribution. And as an outsider, you could easily become tangled in these disputes without even knowing it. Accept a gift from the wrong man. Refuse a drink from another. Speak too warmly to a woman. Promise to someone else. These small acts could ignite fires you could not put out. Over time, the constant readiness for violence, the unrelenting demands of loyalty, and the impossibility of escape would begin to wear you down. You would sleep lightly, always listening for the creak of a door or the whisper of feet outside your sleeping space. And your dreams would be filled with images of the sea, of fire, of eyes watching you in the dark. Even moments of peace would be tinged with unease, for you would know how quickly they could shatter. And perhaps the cruelest part of all is that the longer you stayed, the more you would begin to understand them. You would start to see why they lived as they did, why trust was given sparingly, why strength was celebrated, why caution was survival. And with that understanding would come the realization that you could never fully return to the world you knew, because you would carry their ways inside you, a constant reminder of the days when you lived at the edge of the world, among those who bent to no one and feared nothing but dishonor. The moment you stepped into a Viking settlement in the year 1580, the first thing that would strike you was not the smell of smoke or the sight of longships, but the overwhelming sense of readiness for war. It was in the way every man, woman, and even many children carried themselves alert, eyes scanning, hands never far from a weapon. This was not a society where violence was a rare event. It was a constant possibility woven into the fabric of daily life. The longhouses were built not only for warmth and community, but for defense, with narrow entrances that could be easily blocked, walls reinforced with heavy timbers, and roofs designed to shed both snow and flaming arrows. You would notice that even in moments of rest, warriors kept their shields within arm's reach, axes leaning against benches, spears standing upright in corners. A feast might be loud with laughter, but underneath the noise was a tension, a readiness to spring into action at the first hint of threat. Outsiders often imagine Viking raids as sudden bursts of aggression, but for the Vikings themselves, the readiness to raid or defend was simply life. Every able-bodied man trained with weapons from childhood, not only learning how to swing an axe, but how to read an opponent's stance, how to feel the weight of a shield, how to adjust in a fight that shifted from the open field to the crush of a narrow alley. You would find that strength was respected, but so was precision. Wild swings were for amateurs. A true warrior could end a fight with one measured strike. And fighting was not confined to enemies from far-off lands. Disputes within the community could turn violent with little warning, and duels whether to settle an insult or a claim over land were a legal and accepted part of life. To refuse such a challenge was to admit cowardice, and cowardice was a stain that could follow you for the rest of your days. As an outsider, you might think to avoid all conflict, but here, avoidance could be seen as weakness. And weakness could make you a target. You would be expected to stand your ground, even if it meant risking injury or worse. The Vikings did not fight only with steel, they fought with their minds. Strategy was prized, and leaders often rose not just because they were strong, but because they were clever. You might witness a chieftain delaying an attack not out of fear, but to let the tide change, the weather turn, or an enemy grow overconfident. Raids were timed with precision. often striking at dawn when enemies were still drowsy or at high tide when the ships could make a swift escape. Every battle was a gamble, and the Vikings played the odds with ruthless calculation. Living among them, you would quickly learn that loyalty was not blind, it was earned, tested, and proven again and again. Warriors followed leaders who brought victory and plunder, but if a leader failed too often, loyalty could shift. This was not betrayal in their eyes, it was survival. Alliances were fluid, and you would have to navigate them with care, never assuming that today's ally would not be tomorrow's enemy. The women in this society were not idle bystanders. While men were often away raiding, women managed farms, oversaw trade, and defended homesteads when necessary. A Viking woman could own property, demand divorce, and, in times of danger, take up arms alongside men. Underestimating them could be a fatal mistake, for they wielded not only weapons, but also influence, and their opinions could sway the course of a family's fate. The constant preparation for conflict meant that the settlement itself was built with both life and war in mind. Watchtowers overlooked key approaches, and sentries rotated through the night, their eyes trained on the horizon for sails or smoke. Dogs roamed freely, quick to bark at any unfamiliar scent or sound. Even the placement of livestock was strategic. Animals could be moved quickly in the event of attack, and pens were built to double as barricades. This perpetual readiness came at a cost. Sleep was light and often interrupted. Resources were stockpiled, but feasts and celebrations could drain them quickly if a long winter followed. The weight of knowing that tomorrow could bring battle, that any journey could end in blood, shaped every decision, from when to plant crops to when to marry. And yet, in the midst of this, there was a fierce pride, a belief that to live without this readiness was to live in weakness. The Vikings measured their worth not in years lived, but in the strength of their deeds, the size of their feasts, the songs sung of their victories. If you were to survive here even for a short time, you would have to accept that peace was not the absence of war, but the brief space between battles. And in that space, you were expected to prepare for the next storm. The mental shift required to live like this would be enormous, for it demanded not only skill and courage, but the acceptance that violence was as natural a part of life as the turning of the seasons. You could not soften it, could not reason it away. It was simply the way of the world, and to resist it was to mark yourself for destruction. If the readiness for war defined the Viking community, the harshness of their daily survival shaped the rest of their lives. Food was never taken for granted. Even in fertile lands, the climate of the late 16th century was unpredictable. With sudden storms, early frosts, or heavy rains capable of destroying crops, the Vikings had learned to adapt, planting hardy grains like barley and rye that could survive in poorer soil, storing them in cool, dry chambers lined with stone to protect against moisture and rodents. You would see women grinding grain into flour on heavy quern stones, their hands and shoulders hardened from years of repetition, while others churned butter, smoked fish, or salted meat to prepare for leaner months. The men brought in game from the forests, deer, boar, and birds, but hunting was not a pastime. It was an exhausting, dangerous necessity. Even fishing in the cold northern waters was treacherous, the icy waves capable of capsizing small boats with a single shift of the wind. Meals were simple but hearty, and nothing was wasted. Bones became tools, hides became clothing, and every scrap of meat found a purpose. If you arrived expecting constant feasting like the romanticized sagas describe, you would quickly learn that those lavish meals were rare, reserved for victories, weddings, or seasonal festivals. The rest of the time, meals were functional, meant to keep warriors strong, not to indulge in luxury. You would taste thick stews flavored with onions and herbs, dense bread that could last for weeks, and mead brewed from honey when available, though water from rivers and wells was still the daily drink. Daily labor was unrelenting. Farms needed tending, animals needed feeding, tools required constant repair. Iron rusted quickly in the damp climate, so blacksmiths were essential members of the community, forging not only weapons but nails, hinges, and plow parts. Watching a Viking blacksmith at work, you would be struck by the precision with which he shaped metal, the rhythm of hammer and anvil ringing out like a heartbeat through the settlement. The smoke and heat in his small forge would sting your eyes and coat your skin in soot, yet he worked tirelessly, for without strong tools and weapons, the entire community was vulnerable. Even building and maintaining the longships required skill. These vessels were the pride of the Vikings, sleek, fast, and capable of navigating both open seas and shallow rivers. Shipbuilders worked with oak and pine, shaping each plank to fit perfectly, sealing the seams with tar and wool to keep the water out. These ships were not only for raiding, but for trade, exploration, and communication between settlements. Without them, the Vikings would be trapped within their own lands, unable to expand or respond to threats quickly. You would also notice that the boundary between work and defense was thin. A man repairing a fence might keep a spear within reach. A woman fetching water might carry a small blade. Children were taught from a young age not only how to tend to animals or gather firewood, but how to signal danger, where to hide, and when to run. The Viking sense of community was built on this shared responsibility. Survival was a collective effort. If one family failed to prepare for winter, the whole settlement might be burdened with their survival, and resentment could grow. That tension meant you could not simply rely on the generosity of others without earning your place. You would be expected to contribute from the very first day, whether by working the land, repairing gear, cooking, or guarding the perimeter. Rest came only in small moments by the fire after a day's work, during the telling of sagas that kept history alive, or in the rare quiet of dawn before the rest of the settlement stirred. These stories were more than entertainment. They were lessons in courage, loyalty, and cunning. You would hear tales of great voyages, battles against impossible odds, and tricksters who outwitted stronger foes. The sagas reminded everyone that fate was inescapable, but one could still meet it with honor. In this, the Vikings found meaning in a life that could end at any moment. As an outsider, you might feel the constant weight of risk pressing in from all sides, the knowledge that illness could sweep through the longhouse, that a rival clan might attack at night, that a single failed harvest could bring starvation. But to the Vikings, this awareness was not a burden. It was simply the truth of life. To endure here, you would have to stop longing for safety as you once knew it, and start finding satisfaction in strength, in the resilience that came from meeting each day's challenges without complaint. Only then might you begin to understand why they thrived in conditions that would break others. If the daily labor and constant preparation for survival formed the body of Viking life, it was their code of honor, their spiritual beliefs, and the unyielding social expectations that formed its soul. You would soon find that the Vikings lived according to an invisible but rigid framework of reputation and respect. Every action, every word spoken in the longhouse, every promise made on a trading voyage had weight. A man's honor was his currency, and to lose it was worse than death. An insult might be answered not with angry words, but with a challenge that could end in bloodshed. And even if both parties survived, the wound to one standing could last for generations. You would quickly learn that speech here was not casual. It was deliberate. Oaths were sworn on weapons or sacred objects, and breaking them could lead to exile or execution. This system meant that even small disputes over livestock, land boundaries, or marriage arrangements could escalate with deadly seriousness. In the Middle Ages of the North, laws were spoken rather than written, preserved by the memory of the law speaker, who would recite them aloud during assemblies. If you were summoned to such a gathering, you would stand in a circle of armed men and stern women, listening to disputes be argued in public. Decisions were enforced not by a distant ruler, but by the community itself. A judgment against you meant your neighbors. Those you saw every day would carry out the sentence, whether that meant paying compensation in silver, forfeiting property, or facing outlawry. Outlawry was a fate you could not survive. It stripped you of all protection under the law. Anyone could kill you without consequence, and you could not seek shelter in any home. In such a world, Maintaining alliances was as important as wielding a sword. Marriage was less about romance and more about forging bonds between families or clans. You might witness a marriage negotiation where cattle, land, or future obligations were discussed as carefully as the qualities of the bride and groom. Refusing such arrangements without cause could be seen as an insult, and accepting them bound you to new responsibilities that could last a lifetime. The domestic life of a Viking woman was no less demanding. She managed the household, the stores of food, the weaving of clothes, the raising of children, and in her husband's absence, she might also manage trade or defend the home. Her keys worn on her belt were symbols of authority, granting her the power to access storerooms, chests, and valuables. To lose one's keys through negligence or disgrace was a mark of shame. You would also learn that Viking spirituality was woven into every task. The gods were not distant figures, but active forces in daily life. Odin watched over wisdom and battle. Thor protected against storms and enemies. Freya blessed fertility and love. Offerings might be made at small wooden shrines in the home, at great stone circles, or deep in the forests. Blood sacrifices of animals were not rare, and to witness one was to see the raw connection between survival and faith. A poor harvest might be blamed on insufficient offerings, a sudden illness on the anger of a god or the curse of a rival. In this way, spirituality reinforced the seriousness of their existence. Every misfortune had a cause, and every cause required action. You might find it unsettling to live in a world where fate, or word, was believed to be woven at birth. Yet the Vikings still believed in shaping the manner of their death. They spoke often of Valhalla, the great hall of the slain, where warriors who died bravely would feast forever. To them, how you met your end mattered more than how long you lived. That belief made them fearless in ways that could terrify you. They did not court death recklessly, but when it came, they met it standing, weapon in hand, eyes forward. In such a society, hesitation could be fatal, not only on the battlefield but in negotiations, in judgment, in defending one's honor. As the days passed, you would realize that the Vikings had little patience for indecision. They valued strength, but not just the physical kind. They valued the strength to act, to choose, to accept consequences without complaint. In the cold light of dawn, watching them prepare for another journey, another another defense of their home, you might finally understand why you would not last a day among them. It is not the battles, the weather, or the hunger alone that would break you. It is the relentless expectation that you live every moment ready for the weight of fate to fall, and that when it does, you do not falter. To survive here, you would have to shed the softness of another world entirely and embrace one where survival was not a prize but a duty, and every day was a test you could not afford to fail. If you thought Viking hardship was measured only in cold winters and rough seas, you would be mistaken. Their struggles were constant, not just against the elements or enemies, but against the silent forces of disease, injury, and the limitations of their own medicine. In a world without modern understanding of germs or antiseptics, even a small wound from a blade or axe could mean death if it became infected. The Vikings' toolkit for healing was a mix of hard-earned knowledge and deeply rooted superstition. Healers, often women skilled in herbs and midwifery, knew the uses of plants like yarrow to stop bleeding, willow bark to ease pain, and juniper berries to ward off illness. But such remedies were never purely physical prayers to the gods. Charms carved into bone or wood, and offerings at sacred sites were all part of the process. You would watch as a healer cleaned a wound with cold water from a stream, bound it with linen, then traced runes over the bandage to call on divine protection. Yet in spite of these efforts, you would see many lives cut short not by battle, but by infection, fever, or childbirth. Childbirth itself was a dangerous frontier for Viking women, and every birth was attended with both skill and fear. You would witness a mother gripping the hands of other women as the midwife worked, the air thick with the smell of burning herbs, meant to ward off evil spirits. Sometimes the cries of the newborn would fill the longhouse with joy, but other times silence would fall, and the mother might be carried to her bed for the last time. In such a place, death was accepted but never welcomed, and grief had its own rituals. Mourners might gather around the body, singing chants, preparing grave goods, and speaking the name of the departed so their spirit would be carried to the next world. You would learn quickly that in Viking belief, death was not an end, but a crossing. A warrior's soul might go to Valhalla or Folkvanger, a farmer's to hell, not a place of punishment, but of quiet rest. Still, the manner of your death would be remembered and spoken of for generations. It would define your story, your reputation, and the way your descendants were treated. And so you would feel the constant pressure to live bravely, to avoid the shame of dying poorly. The practicalities of daily life left no room for weakness. Illness did not excuse you from work unless it left you unable to stand. Food had to be gathered, animals cared for, nets mended, and wood cut regardless of aches or fevers. You would see a man with a broken arm still working with one hand, a woman with a limp still tending to her loom, because the survival of the household depended on it. Mercy was scarce, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. To feed someone who could not contribute meant taking food from another. This harsh truth would weigh heavily on you, because it would force you to confront how dependent you had always been on the comforts of another time. In the Viking world, there were no idle hands in winter, no safety nets in famine, and famine came often. A failed harvest, a storm that sank a fishing boat, or disease among livestock could plunge an entire settlement into hunger. You would sit at the longhouse table, the portions of porridge smaller each night, watching the elders push their bowls away so the children could eat. Hunger would carve sharp edges into people's faces, thinning them until their skin clung to bone. Some would survive by foraging for roots and berries under the snow, others by slaughtering the last animals, knowing it would leave them without breeding stock for spring. In such times, the Vikings' reputation for raiding was not born only from greed, but from desperation. The longships would be readied, the sails mended, and men would set out not only to claim silver and goods, but to find food to keep their people alive. If you thought you could stand aside from such choices, you would quickly learn otherwise. Here, survival was communal. If the group decided to raid, you would row, fight, or be left behind to face whatever came. And being left behind could be worse than facing the enemy, for it meant facing hunger with no allies. You might think the sea was safer than famine, but you would be wrong. The North Sea and surrounding waters were as much an enemy as any armed man. Storms could arise without warning, and waves could swallow a ship whole. Yet the Vikings sailed them year after year, their ships cutting through ice-chilled waters toward foreign coasts. You would stand on the deck, the wind whipping your face raw, the spray soaking you through, and wonder how they endured such endless danger without losing their nerve. The truth was, they did fear, but they feared starvation and dishonor more. In this way, every hardship was weighed against the greater threat of being remembered as a coward or as dead weight to the community. That constant, unyielding standard would begin to feel like a weight on your own shoulders, a reminder that in the Viking world, your worth was measured every day, and there was no forgiveness for failing the test. If survival among the Vikings required endurance in the face of hunger, sickness, and storm, it also demanded a mind hardened against the constant presence of violence. This was not an occasional reality, but a current that ran through every aspect of life, from politics to family disputes to the quiet resentment between neighbors. You would quickly learn that disagreements were rarely solved with words alone, and that the line between argument and bloodshed was thin. Feuds could last generations, sparked by something as simple as the theft of livestock or an insult at a feast. Such disputes were not confined to the men who fought them. They entangled entire families, drawing in cousins, uncles, and allies, until the original grievance was buried beneath years of retaliatory blows. You would see that weapons were never far from reach, and that skill with them was as necessary as knowing how to build a fire. Boys began training as soon as they could lift a wooden sword, and by the time they could wield steel, they were expected to use it without hesitation. Even a farmer, whose hands were more familiar with plow handles than sword hilts, would keep a spear in the corner of his home, ready for the moment danger arrived. And danger did not only come from within the community. Viking settlements, scattered along coasts and rivers, were vulnerable to attack from rival clans or foreign forces. You would hear the shouts before dawn, the crash of shields as men ran to meet an approaching threat. The longhouse would erupt into ordered chaos, men arming themselves, women and children gathering valuables and retreating to safer ground if they could. You would be handed a weapon, even if you had no skill, because in such moments every able body mattered. The fight would be brutal and fast, the air filled with the ring of iron and the sharp cries of the wounded. You would understand quickly that there was no safe spectator's place in this world. You were either part of the defense or you were a liability. But violence was not only about defense, it was also a tool for asserting dominance and securing resources. Raiding was an accepted and celebrated part of life. Ships would be prepared not just for exploration or trade, but for swift, targeted strikes against settlements and monasteries. You might find yourself rowing under a cold dawn sky, your muscles burning with each pull of the oar, knowing that on arrival there would be no negotiation, only speed and force. The rewards were tangible silver, livestock, grain, captives who could be ransomed or enslaved, but so were the risks. Defenders could be as fierce as any Viking, and the possibility of dying on foreign soil was always present. Yet, for the Vikings, this was a worthy gamble, for success brought not only material wealth but prestige, and prestige meant security for your family and allies. Refusing to participate, on the other hand, could brand you as a coward, a mark that would follow you for life. The pressure to conform to this warrior culture would be relentless. Even moments of peace carried the undercurrent of potential conflict. Feasts, which might seem like purely joyous gatherings, were arenas where alliances were tested and rivalries sharpened. You would sit at long tables lit by firelight, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat and mead, and watch as subtle insults were delivered through backhanded compliments or boasts that diminished others. A poorly timed laugh, a careless word, could ignite tensions that spilled into violence before the night ended. In such an environment, you would have to train yourself not only to endure physical hardship, but to navigate a constant social battlefield, knowing when to speak, when to stay silent, when to show strength, and when to yield. These were as crucial to survival as knowing how to wield a weapon. This mental strain, the need to remain vigilant in every setting, would wear on you as much as any physical challenge. And yet, you would see that for the Vikings, this constant readiness was not merely a burden but a source of pride. It proved their worth to their peers, to their ancestors, and to the gods they believed watched their every action. They lived in the knowledge that life was fleeting, and so they seized it with both hands, unafraid to meet its dangers head-on. You, coming from a softer world, would feel the weight of this truth pressing in from all sides, and realize that here, survival was never just about living another day. It was about living that day in a way that others would speak of long after you were gone. If you had managed to survive the physical hardships and the constant threat of violence among the Vikings, you would still be faced with the unyielding demands of honor, a concept so deeply woven into their identity that to misunderstand it could be as deadly as any sword. Honor was not an abstract ideal. It was the currency by which your worth was measured, the foundation of your reputation, and the invisible armor that protected your place in the community. Every word you spoke, every action you took, every alliance you formed or broke was weighed against the scale of this relentless code. To a modern mind, the rules of honor might seem contradictory. Mercy could be seen as weakness. Restraint could be misinterpreted as fear. And yet, a reckless blow struck in anger could stain your name forever if it was judged to be dishonorable. Here, the judgment did not come from courts or written law, but from the eyes and voices of your peers. Once a man's honor was questioned, the shadow it cast could last for generations, clinging to his descendants like a curse. You would soon see that disputes were settled not only by combat but by intricate systems of restitution. known as Wergild the man price. If someone was killed, the family of the killer was expected to pay compensation to the victim's family, the amount depending on the status of the dead. Refusing to pay, or accepting too little, could restart the cycle of blood feud. Negotiating such settlements required a delicate balance of firmness and diplomacy, and failure could drag entire clans into conflict. As an outsider, you would find it nearly impossible to navigate this complex web, for it required not only fluency in the language, but a deep understanding of the cultural weight behind each decision. Honor also extended to hospitality, a sacred duty among the Vikings. Turning away a traveler in need was considered shameful, even dangerous, for the gods themselves were said to walk the earth in disguise, testing the generosity of mortals. This meant that your home, however humble, could be filled with strangers at any time, and you would be expected to offer them food, drink, and a place to sleep. Yet hospitality was not without risk. A guest could be a spy, an enemy, or simply someone whose presence brought trouble to your door. Still, refusing could brand you as dishonorable, a mark that could isolate you from allies when you needed them most. And there was another side to honor, one that would weigh heavily on you if you lived among them, the expectation of vengeance. If a wrong was done to you or your kin and you did nothing, it was not just your own standing that suffered. Your inaction would shame your entire family. Vengeance was seen as a duty, not a choice, and to ignore it was to invite further insult and attack. This created a world in which grudges could last lifetimes, and in which peace was always fragile, resting on the unspoken agreement that honor had been satisfied for now. The pressure to uphold this code would shape every decision you made, forcing you to measure the possible damage to your name before you acted. It would demand constant self-control, even in moments when fear or anger threatened to overwhelm you. You would see that to survive here was not just to keep breathing, but to continually prove, in ways both subtle and brutal, that you were worthy of the respect and protection of the community. The toll on your mind would be immense. Every social interaction would feel like a test. Every glance from another's eyes, a silent assessment of your worth. You would live with the null edge, that one misstep, one poorly chosen word, one display of cowardice, one refusal to defend your honor could unravel everything you had built. For the Vikings, this vigilance was second nature, taught from childhood and reinforced by the stories of their ancestors. For you, it would be a constant strain, a weight that pressed against your shoulders day and night, until you realized that in this world, death was not the worst fate. To live without honor, to walk among your people stripped of respect, was a fate more feared than the battlefield. And in that moment, you would understand that the true challenge of surviving among the Vikings was not enduring the cold, the hunger, or the violence. It was living every day in such a way that when your name was spoken, it was done so with respect, and when your story was told, it was worth the telling. If you had managed to endure the crushing weight of Viking honor, there would still be the constant pull of their belief system, an intricate tapestry of gods, spirits, and unseen forces that shaped every moment of their lives and would, inevitably, shape yours. The Norse worldview was not one of distant deities removed from the daily affairs of men. Their gods walked among them, fought alongside them, and demanded their share of offerings and loyalty. Odin, the All-Father, was a figure of wisdom and war, a god who sacrificed an eye for knowledge and hung upon Yggdrasil, the world tree, to gain the runes. Thor, the Thunderer, was the protector of mankind, wielding Mjolnir against the forces of chaos. Freya was beauty, love, and war entwined into one, while Loki, the trickster, blurred the line between ally and enemy. But the Vikings did not simply pray to these figures, they bargained with them, honored them through sacrifice, and interpreted every storm, harvest, and battle as a sign of their favor or displeasure. As an outsider, you would find that belief was not confined to temples or holy days. It infused every decision, every journey, every oath. Before setting sail, men would offer blood to the gods to ensure safe passage. Before a raid, the seer or Volva, a woman skilled in prophecy, would be consulted. her visions shaping the course of action. These seers, feared and respected, would speak in riddles, their words heavy with the weight of destiny. To disregard such counsel was to tempt fate, and in a society where fate, or word, was an unyielding thread woven by the Norns, tempting fate was a dangerous act indeed. The rituals themselves could be unsettling to you. Animal sacrifice was common, blood was sprinkled upon the participants, the idols and the walls of the sacred space, binding man and God in a shared purpose. There were darker whispers, too, of human sacrifice at great gatherings, when the stakes were highest and the need for divine favor greatest. Such acts were rare, but their memory lingered, a reminder that the gods demanded much from their followers. You would see that their spirituality was not gentle. It was as fierce as their winters, as demanding as their seas. Yet it was also deeply binding, a force that held their communities together through shared rituals and stories. Around the hearth, in the long winter nights, sagas would be told tales of heroes, monsters, and the inevitable doom of Ragnarok, when even the gods would fall. These stories were not meant to comfort but to steel the heart, to remind all who listened that life was fleeting and glory was eternal. To live without seeking honor was to waste the gift of life the gods had given. You would feel the pull of these beliefs, even if you did not share them. To refuse to participate in the rites could mark you as an outsider, perhaps even an enemy. To speak ill of the gods, or worse, to mock them, would be unthinkable. An insult not only to the divine but to the entire community. Even if you were careful, there would be moments when you stumbled, when a careless word or skeptical glance could be interpreted as disrespect. And then there was the constant awareness of omens. A raven flying overhead, a sudden change in the wind, a dream of fire or flood, these were not ignored. They were messages, warnings, or promises, and failing to heed them could mean disaster. Decisions were delayed, journeys postponed, raids abandoned, all because a sign was read as unfavorable. You might chafe at the constraints this imposed, but to the Vikings, it was simple prudence. The gods spoke in many ways, and only a fool refused to listen. Over time, you would find yourself watching the skies, noting the flight of birds, the shape of clouds, the way the flames danced in the hearth. You would learn the runes, not as mere letters, but as symbols of power, each carrying its own meaning and magic. You might even find yourself whispering a prayer before sleep, not out of belief, but out of the creeping fear that perhaps there was truth in these old ways, and that ignoring them might draw the wrong kind of attention after powers you did not understand. Yet the most difficult part would be the acceptance of fate. In the Norse mind, your word was fixed, woven before you were born, unchangeable even by the gods. This could be a source of strength if death was inevitable. Then courage was the only reasonable choice. But it could also be a source of despair, for no matter how you struggled, the end was already written. Living under this weight, knowing that even the mightiest gods were doomed, would shape your thoughts in ways you could not imagine. You would learn to face each day as if it were your last, to seek glory in every deed, to leave behind a name worth remembering. And yet, for someone not raised in this belief, the constant presence of death in every story, every ritual, every thought, might gnaw at your spirit until you began to see the world not as a place of possibility, but as a battlefield in which survival was a temporary victory on the march to an inevitable end. Living among the Vikings meant embracing a world where the boundary between the living and the dead was not fixed but shifting, where spirits could linger, ancestors could guide, and the dead could demand. Their funeral rites reflected this belief in ways that would both astonish and unsettle you. When a chieftain died, the funeral was not a quiet affair of mourning, but a public display of honor, wealth, and power. The dead were not simply buried, they were sent off with all that they might need in the next life. For some, this meant a burial mound, carefully constructed and marked so that future generations would remember. For others, particularly those of high status or great renown, it meant a ship burial, the vessel itself becoming both coffin and chariot, carrying the deceased to the halls of the gods. Into these graves went weapons, tools, clothing, jewelry, and food. Horses were slaughtered to carry the master in the afterlife, and there are accounts written by outsiders that speak of human sacrifice as part of the rites. Slaves who would accompany their masters beyond death. These accounts, though debated, reveal the depth of the Viking conviction that death was not an ending but a transition, a journey requiring provision and companionship. The rituals surrounding death were as much for the living as for the dead. A funeral was a statement, a declaration of the dead's honor and the family's standing. It was also a reminder to all present of the values they held: dear courage, loyalty, generosity, and of the price of failing to live by them. You would find yourself standing among a crowd, watching the pyre's flames leap into the sky, feeling the heat on your face, smelling the mingled scents of wood smoke, burning pitch, and flesh. You might tell yourself you do not believe in the journey the flames mark. Yet part of you would feel the weight of the moment, the sense that something had been set in motion that could not be undone. The belief in an afterlife was not uniform among the Vikings, and that too might surprise you. Warriors hoped to reach Valhalla, Odin's Hall, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok. Others might find their way to Folkvanger, the field of Freya, equally honored. The sea folks spoke of Rand's Hall beneath the waves, where those lost at sea would dwell. Some feared Hell, the realm of the dead that was not a place of torment, but of cold, shadow, and stillness. The manner of your death determined your destination. Bravery in battle could earn you glory, while death from sickness or old age might lead you to quieter, less honored halls. This focus on the manner of dying would change how you viewed every moment of your life. Illness would not just be misfortune, it would be an insult to your legacy. An unheroic death could stain your name for generations. You might find yourself taking risks you never would have considered before, all in the hope of meeting death on your feet, weapon in hand, with witnesses to tell the tale. But even as they honored the dead, the Vikings feared the restless spirits of those who were not properly sent on their way. The Draugr, undead beings swollen with unnatural strength, were said to guard their treasures or seek vengeance on the living. These tales were more than superstition, they were warnings. Graves were sometimes protected with stones or iron to keep the dead from walking. In times of famine or misfortune, blame might fall on an unquiet spirit, and rituals would be performed to lay it to rest. As a newcomer, you might dismiss such stories, only to find yourself unable to sleep after hearing the heavy, deliberate tread of footsteps outside the longhouse on a moonless night. Death was not the end of danger. It was simply a change in its shape. And because of this, every aspect of life was bound to the preparation for death. Children learned the sagas not just to pass the time, but to understand what was expected of them when their moment came. Women prepared the shrouds and the burial gifts. Men built the mounds and carved the runestones. To live without this constant awareness would be to live poorly in their eyes. You, used to a world where death is often hidden away, would struggle under its relentless presence. Yet over time, you might begin to see its purpose. In a world as harsh and unpredictable as theirs, where storms could destroy a harvest and an enemy raid could wipe out a settlement, the Vikings chose to face death directly, to weave it into their stories and their celebrations. It was not morbid, it was practical. And in that practicality lay a kind of freedom. For once you accepted the certainty of death, you could give yourself wholly to the moments of life that remained. This was the heart of their resilience, and the reason you, with all your modern fears and comforts, would likely not last a day among them. If you had managed to survive this long among the Vikings, by the time you reached the deeper heart of their world, you would begin to see that their survival was not only a matter of strength and skill, but of something subtler and harder to grasp: an instinctive awareness of fate and a complete acceptance of its demands. They called it word, a concept that was neither fully predestination nor simple chance, but a weaving of each person's life into the larger fabric of the world. In the sagas, word was as present as the characters themselves, shaping the rise and fall of kings, the victories of warriors, the tragedies of lovers. The Norns, three shadowy figures who lived at the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree, were said to spin, measure, and cut the threads of all lives. To live among the Vikings was to live with the certainty that your thread had a length set before you drew your first breath, and nothing you did could lengthen or shorten it. This certainty was not paralyzing, it was liberating. They did not waste time on what if. They acted. They took what they desired when the chance arose. They fought when insult demanded it. They traveled when their heart pulled them toward the horizon. In this, you might find a kind of envy, for they moved through life without the hesitation that plagues the modern mind. Yet this acceptance of word carried its own burdens. It meant that grudges could last for generations, for if fate had placed you in opposition to another, to deny that struggle was to deny the very weave of the world. Feuds became as inevitable as the seasons, and some could not be ended without blood. You, who might be used to negotiation, compromise, and the slow machinery of courts, would be out of your depth in a world where disputes were settled in the space of a heartbeat, where the wrong glance could be taken as an insult worth steel. Even their justice was bound to word. Law gatherings, the things, were as much about confirming the fate of a matter as about deciding it. Chiefs and elders would listen to disputes, but their verdicts often echoed what everyone already believed, that the course of events had been decided long before. Punishments were not only practical, but symbolic, ensuring that the fabric of the world was not torn by injustice. A thief might be outlawed, declared a man without protection. His life forfeit to any who chose to take it. A killer might be required to pay wergild, a man price, to the family of the slain. Fail to pay, and your fate was sealed. This was justice, Viking-style, direct, final, and always mindful of the greater weave. Beyond word, another force shaped their lives' honor. Honor was not an abstract ideal, but a tangible currency, as real as silver or land. Lose your honor, and you lost your place in the community. Regain it, and doors once shut would open. Every action was measured against this scale. To break an oath was not simply to lie, it was to unravel your standing, to make yourself untrustworthy in a world where trust was a matter of survival. You would find that this constant weighing of honor made even casual words dangerous. A boast, if unproven, could be turned against you. A promise, however small, would be remembered and expected to be fulfilled. This would wear on you, used as you might be to a more forgiving society. Here, the social web was taut, and any false step could send a shiver of consequence through the entire weave. This intensity bled into every aspect of life. Feasts were not only times of joy, but of testing who sat where, who spoke first, who offered the largest gift, who returned the most clever toast. Warfare, too, was not only about land or loot, but about reputation, about proving your worth in the eyes of your peers and your gods. To shrink from a challenge was to diminish yourself in ways that no amount of later bravery could repair. And so, they lived with a constant awareness of the eyes upon them, the eyes of their kin, their enemies, their gods, and the generations yet unborn who would hear their story. You would feel those eyes too, and they would change you. Slowly, perhaps, you would learn to move with a certain boldness, to speak with a deliberate weight, to act without hesitation. And perhaps you would begin to understand why hesitation, in their world, was often the same as death. But even if you adapted to the pace, the risks, the demands of word and honor, there would always remain the physical and emotional strain. The Viking world was unrelenting. There were no true seasons of rest. Winter was a time of preparation for spring raids or defense, of mending ships and weapons, of making deals for the next trading voyage. Summer brought travel, warfare, exploration, and labor in the fields. Autumn was for the harvest, for storing food, for building fortifications. Every moment was filled with purpose. To falter, to become complacent, was to invite ruin. It was this ceaseless demand that would eventually break you, more than the cold, more than the danger, more than the alien beliefs. You might endure a week, a month, perhaps even a year. But one day, when the wind howled through the longhouse and the smell of smoke and sweat pressed in, When your muscles ached from labor and your ears rang from the constant noise of life, you would realize the truth. The Vikings were not simply stronger, braver, or more ruthless than you. They were shaped by a world that allowed for nothing less. You were shaped by a different world, one where survival could be taken for granted. And in that moment, you would understand exactly why you would not last a single day among them. By the time you reached what might be called the cultural core of Viking life, you would begin to see that survival here was not just about muscle, weapons, or endurance. It was about belonging, about weaving yourself into the social fabric in ways that would ensure protection, loyalty, and a sense of purpose. The Vikings lived in tight-knit communities where everyone's role was both defined and essential. Farmers, warriors, traders, smiths, shipbuilders, weavers, each contributed to the whole, and the whole sustained them in return. There was no such thing as a self-sufficient loner who could thrive indefinitely. Even the most skilled warrior depended on the work of others to feed him, arm him, and carry him across the sea. You might think that your independence and ability to manage on your own would impress them, but here it would raise suspicion. Why are you apart? Why do you not trust the community? Trust was currency, and without it, you were as good as dead. Trust, however, came with obligations. Once bound to a group through kinship, oath, or alliance, you were expected to give as much as you received. If a neighbor's barn burned, you helped rebuild it. If your kinsman's son was killed, you were drawn into the blood feud, regardless of your personal feelings. To refuse was unthinkable. It would mark you as dishonorable, a liability in a society where reputation was life. These obligations extended to hospitality, one of the most sacred duties among the Norse. A guest was to be treated with generosity, fed, housed, and protected for as long as was reasonable. This was not just kindness, but a strategic necessity in a land where travel was dangerous and alliances fragile. Refusing hospitality could turn a potential ally into a bitter enemy, and offering it could bind someone to you in loyalty that might save your life later. But hospitality was a double-edged sword. If you offered shelter, you were responsible for your guests' actions while under your roof. If they caused offense or harm, the stain was on you as much as on them. You would be expected to make amends, even if you had no part in the wrongdoing. In such a system, the line between your fate and the fate of others was thin, and you would often find yourself paying for the mistakes of people you barely knew. Beyond these obligations, there was the art of negotiation and alliance building, a skill as vital as swordsmanship. Viking society was not an unbroken chain of battles and bloodshed. It was also a complex web of treaties, marriages, and trade agreements. Chieftains and kings measured their power not only in warriors, but in the number of loyal households, trading partners, and allied jarls they could count on. The sea alliances could shift quickly, and to survive, you had to sense the undercurrents: who was rising, who was falling, who could be trusted, and who would betray you the moment the wind changed. In this environment, words were weapons as sharp as any blade. A poorly chosen phrase in the wrong ears could set in motion a chain of events ending in your death. The sagas are full of such moments, feasts where an insult, half-meant, or even unintended, led to vengeance carried out years later. This constant vigilance over speech and behavior would weigh heavily on you. In the modern world, you can afford to be careless at times. In theirs, carelessness was a luxury you could not afford. And then there was the matter of religion, which was less a separate sphere of life than the invisible thread binding it all together. The Norse pantheon, Odin, Thor, Freyja, and countless others, was not a distant, abstract belief, but a living presence in daily affairs. Every voyage began with offerings, every harvest with thanks, every battle with prayers or curses. The gods were not moral in the way you might expect. They were powerful, capricious, and as bound by fate as humans were. To live among the Vikings was to live in a state of negotiation with forces beyond your control, always seeking their favor and fearing their wrath. You would be expected to participate in rituals blots, where animals were sacrificed and their blood sprinkled to bless the people and their tools. Seasonal festivals that marked the turning of the year. Oaths sworn in the names of gods who would punish oath-breakers with sickness or ruin. Refusal to take part could isolate you, marking you as an outsider, perhaps even a threat. Participation, however, came with its own challenges. The visceral nature of Norse ritual, the smell of blood, the roar of feasting, the solemn recitation of oaths before all might unsettle you in ways you did not expect. It was one thing to read of such practices in a history book, quite another to stand in the thick of them, knowing your place in the community might depend on your willingness to embrace what you saw. Even art and storytelling, which you might expect to be safe ground, were charged with the same intensity. Skalds, the poets of the Viking world, wielded enormous influence. A skilled skald could immortalize your deeds in verse, ensuring your name lived on for generations. A satirical verse, however, could ruin you, making you a laughingstock and inviting challenges to your honor. This power of words meant that public performance was not just entertainment, but political maneuvering. You would have to learn quickly what was safe to praise, whom to flatter, and when to stay silent. By now, you would have realized that Viking life demanded constant performance, not in the sense of acting falsely, but in the sense of living always in full view of others, always mindful that your worth was being weighed in every gesture, every word, every choice. There was no anonymity here. You could not simply disappear into a crowd or start over somewhere new without your past following you. And if that past contained shame, failure, or dishonor, it would cling to you as tightly as your own shadow. In such a place, survival was not a single act, but a continuous process. 1,000 small decisions made correctly, 1,000 tests passed without faltering. And even if you mastered them all, there was still the relentless environment to contend with the cold that never fully left your bones, the hunger that could return with one bad harvest, the danger that lurked in every voyage, raid, and political turn. The Vikings endured it because they knew nothing else. You, however, would feel its weight more with each passing day, until the very act of keeping up became the greatest battle you had ever fought. If by some miracle you had managed to secure a place within a Viking household, earn the grudging respect of your peers, and avoid fatal mistakes in politics or hospitality, you would still face another trial that would test the very core of your being, the rhythm of daily life itself. There was no pause, no indulgent rest, no sense that you could simply take a day off because you were tired or in poor spirits. The seasons dictated the flow of existence, and each day was shaped by necessity, not by choice. In winter, light was scarce and precious, the day reduced to a dim window between a long, freezing night and another equally cold dusk. Work did not stop because the sun barely rose. If anything, it became more urgent. Animals had to be tended in the biting wind, tools repaired by smoky firelight, ships maintained in sheds that smelled of pitch and pine. Every sound, the hiss of snow against walls, the creak of ice in the rafters was a reminder that a misstep could mean freezing or starvation. Come spring, the tempo shifted to frantic preparation. This was when fields were plowed, seeds sown, fishing gear repaired for the great summer hauls, and ships readied for voyages. You would learn quickly that every task was urgent because every task was connected. If the field was planted late, the harvest would fail. If the fishing nets were not mended in time, you would lose the season's catch. If the ship was not seaworthy when the wind changed, you could not trade, raid, or travel. The margin for error was so thin that one failure could ripple through the entire year, bringing hunger or ruin. The demands did not end with work. They extended into the physical resilience expected of everyone. Viking life was unrelentingly physical. You carried loads, rowed for hours, waded into freezing water to secure boats, cut timber with axes that weighed nearly as much as a modern sledgehammer. There was no division between men's work and women's work in the way you might imagine. While some tasks were culturally assigned, everyone's labor was essential. Women not only kept households running, but often took part in farm work, trade, and even defense when needed. A woman might wield a loom 1 hour and a weapon the next if the settlement came under attack. Your modern muscles, softened by a lifetime of convenience, would scream under such demands, and there would be no sympathy for your exhaustion. Pain was simply part of life, so was danger. For even in times of peace, the possibility of violence hung over everything like the shadow of a hawk over a field. Disputes could erupt into fights with little warning, and you would be expected to defend yourself and your household without hesitation. Training with weapons was not just for warriors. It was a basic skill, like knowing how to light a fire or preserve meat. Sword, axe, spear, and bow were all familiar tools, and you would be expected to know how to use them well enough to hold your own, even if you were not a champion. There was also the constant, grinding work of navigation, literal and social. You might be sent to a neighboring settlement as part of a trade caravan, expected to carry goods, negotiate fair terms, and return with news of political shifts. Such journeys could take days over treacherous terrain, with weather, rivers, and strangers as unpredictable hazards. You could not afford to be slow or indecisive. Hesitation could cost your life. And while traveling, you would have to maintain the same keen awareness you kept at home, listening for gossip that hinted at feuds, noticing changes in who was allied with whom, assessing whether the people you met might be friends, enemies, or both in different circumstances. The nights would bring no real rest. Viking households were communal, often with an entire family and their thralls sleeping in the same hall, sometimes alongside animals in the colder months. Privacy was non-existent, and the sounds, smells, and interruptions would be constant. Babies cried, dogs barked, someone coughed through the night, the fire had to be tended, and if the weather turned violent, you might wake to the sound of the roof groaning under the weight of snow. And yet, you were expected to rise at dawn and begin again. Layered over all of this was the omnipresent weight of honor, the invisible but unbreakable code that governed every interaction. Honor was not a vague ideal. It was measurable in how you kept your word, how you responded to insults, how you treated kin and guests, and how you faced danger. Lose your honor, and you lost your place in society. Regaining it could take years, and sometimes it was impossible. In such a world, even your death had to be conducted with a certain dignity, for dying well was considered as important as living well. To show fear, to beg for mercy, to fail to avenge an insult, these were stains that could not be washed away. And so you would find yourself constantly guarding not only your body but your name, as though both could be attacked at any moment. The mental toll of such vigilance would be immense. Even when you were not physically laboring, your mind would be calculating what must be done today, who might be offended, what alliances need strengthening, what threats might arise. The future was always a thing to be prepared for, never something to drift into casually. And yet, for all this, there would be moments that could almost convince you it was worth the struggle. A hall lit with firelight and filled with the sound of skalds reciting tales of gods and heroes. A shared meal after a day of backbreaking labor. When the bread is warm, the mead flows, and laughter cuts through the fatigue. The sight of the sea at dawn, your ship ready, the wind at your back. These moments were rare, fleeting, but they were the glue that held the Viking world together. Without them, the weight of survival might be too much to bear. But those moments were earned, not given, and you would come to understand that you had to pay for them every single day with your sweat, your vigilance, and sometimes your blood. In the end, the hardest truth to accept would be that there was no point at which you could truly say you had made it. In the Viking world, survival was not a destination but an endless road, and one misstep could send you tumbling into the void. Even if you had endured the physical hardship, the unending work, the constant readiness for violence, and the invisible weight of honor that pressed on you from sunrise to sunset, there would still be something that could undo you faster than any blade or storm, the relentless uncertainty of the Viking world. This was not a society built on the promise of stability. A good harvest one year could be followed by famine the next. An ally in spring might become an enemy by autumn. The sea that brought you wealth and freedom could just as easily swallow you whole without warning. Every plan, no matter how carefully made, had to account for the fact that fate could sweep it away like snow in the wind. In this world, fate was not just a word. It was a living concept, spoken of in the sagas, woven into the beliefs of the people. The Norns, the weavers of destiny, were said to cut the threads of life without pity or pause. You could live well, fight bravely, keep every oath, and still meet an end so senseless it defied reason. A sudden sickness, a shipwreck within sight of shore, a raid at dawn when you were still half asleep. These were not rare tragedies, but expected risks. To live among the Vikings meant accepting that death was always close enough to taste in the air. That nearness changed how they thought, how they spoke, how they loved. Relationships were forged with the knowledge that they could be cut short without warning. Love was intense, but practical affection shone in the giving of food, the mending of clothes, the sharpening of a blade. Words of comfort were rare, not because they did not care, but because such things felt fragile in a world where tomorrow was never promised. To you, used to the idea that you might plan years ahead, this would be disorienting. To them, it was simply life. Yet for all its harshness, this uncertainty bred a certain kind of courage. The Vikings valued not only the warrior who could swing an axe, but also the person who could meet fate with unflinching eyes. It was why stories of doomed heroes were told with such pride, not because they survived, but because they met their end with honor. You would hear these tales around the fire, of men who fought until their last breath on foreign shores, of women who defended their homes against impossible odds, of leaders who refused to flee, even when the enemy closed in. These were not tragedies to them, but instructions. This is how you face the inevitable. But understanding the lesson and living it are not the same. Could you truly look death in the face without begging for more time? Could you watch the sea take someone you cared for and still believe it was simply the will of the gods? The Viking answer would have to be yes, for anything else would be weakness. And weakness was not something they forgave easily. You might think that peace, real, lasting peace, would be your escape, the thing that made it possible to finally breathe. But in the Viking world, peace was not the absence of war. It was a fragile arrangement, always one insult or one broken promise away from collapse. Feasts held to seal alliances could end in blood if a guest felt slighted. A trade agreement could be shattered by the smallest act of deceit. You would have to be as skilled in reading a room as you were in wielding a weapon, knowing when to speak, when to be silent, and when to leave before trouble began. Even in peace, danger waited for the unwary. And then there was the weight of the past. The sagas were not just entertainment. They were history, morality, and warning. You would be measured against the deeds of those who came before you. A son might be expected to avenge a father's death even decades later. A daughter could be held responsible for keeping the family's alliances alive through marriage. The dead shaped the living, and you would find yourself carrying burdens you did not choose, bound to a chain of duty that stretched back generations. There was no clean break from history here. Every action you took was part of a longer story, one that others felt entitled to control. Over time, you might begin to feel the strange pull of this way of life. The hardship would still grind at you, the uncertainty would still gnaw at your sleep, but there would be a raw clarity to it all. You would know exactly what was expected of you, even if meeting those expectations meant blood, sweat, and sacrifice. You would see beauty in the stark lines of a longship against the horizon, in the flash of steel under the sun, in the brief but fierce joy of a feast after a victory. And yet, the question would remain, could you truly survive it? Not just for a day or a week, but for a lifetime. Could you endure knowing that every sunrise might bring your last chance to set something right? Could you live with the constant edge of danger, not as an interruption, but as the fabric of daily life? For most who imagine themselves among the Vikings, the answer is no. Not because they lack courage in the moment, but because they lack the endurance to meet that moment every single day. The Vikings did not simply survive their world, they mastered it, shaped it, accepted it on its own brutal terms. To stand among them, to truly belong, you would have to do the same. and that is why you would not last a day. Because in their world, a day was not a small thing to endure. It was a lifetime's worth of challenge, and it demanded everything you had to give. The dawn came not with the gentle warmth you might imagine, but with the hard bite of cold air that cut through whatever furs or blankets you wrapped around yourself. In the Viking world, the first light of day was not an invitation to linger in comfort. It was a command to rise, to work, to be ready before the world around you even began to stir. The fire from the night before would have burned down to glowing embers, and it was your task to coax it back to life before the chill settled too deep into your bones. Every day began with this simple reminder: nothing stayed warm or safe unless you made it so. The household moved quickly and without waste. Bread had to be baked before the heat of the hearth was given over to other tasks. Animals needed feeding and watering before you even thought of your own meal. If you were in a coastal settlement, the boats had to be checked, ropes untangled, sails mended, hulls scraped of barnacles. In a farming village, the day's labor might be in the fields, the woods, or in tending livestock, and each came with its own demands. There was no pause, no moment where the world would wait for you to gather your thoughts. You learned to think with your hands busy, to plan while your body worked. For you, used to separating mental tasks from physical ones, this would feel like a constant strain. To the Vikings, it was simply the rhythm of life. And that rhythm did not allow for weakness. An injury was not a reason to stop working. It was an obstacle to be managed while still meeting your obligations. A fever might keep you from the heaviest tasks, but you would still be expected to help in whatever way you could. Rest was not given freely, it had to be earned, and even then, it was rarely complete. The only people who stopped working entirely were the very old, and even they would often spend their days mending clothes, tending children, or telling stories that carried the weight of history and instruction. The presence of the sea, or its absence, shaped the day in ways you might not expect. For coastal Vikings, tides dictated much of the schedule. Low tide might be the only chance to gather certain shellfish or repair sections of the boat, normally hidden underwater. Weather could change everything in an instant. A sudden shift in the wind could mean a quick decision to launch for a raid, a trade run, or simply to take advantage of favorable fishing conditions. Inland, the cycles of planting and harvest ruled life with the same level of authority. The seasons dictated what you did, how you ate, how you prepared for the future, and any failure to meet those demands meant facing the next season with less than you needed. Yet, for all this constant work, the Vikings were not without joy. There was laughter in the work, in shared tasks done with skill and pride. There were moments when the entire community came together not in idle leisure, but in purposeful celebration. A wedding feast, the return of a longship, the marking of a seasonal festival. These were times when food and drink flowed freely, when songs and dances filled the hall, when stories were told so vividly you could almost see the long-dead heroes rise again in the flicker of firelight. But even these moments carried an edge. A careless W, or spoken over a cup of mead, could be remembered as an insult for years. A boast made too boldly might be seen as a challenge. The Viking world was one where reputation was as valuable as gold, and it could be gained or lost in the span of a single evening. You would have to measure every word, every gesture, knowing that others were doing the same. And underlying it all was the ever-present knowledge that this day, like every day, might be the last before the world changed. A neighboring chieftain might decide to test his strength against yours. A storm could destroy your store of grain. A sickness could sweep through the community before anyone realized what had taken root. You could not live in this world without carrying the awareness of these risks in your chest. It was not paranoia, it was preparation. And the Vikings were masters of it. They did not waste time fearing what might come. They spent their energy making sure that when it did, they would be ready. You, on the other hand, would feel that constant readiness wearing you down. The tension would build in your shoulders, your stomach, in the way you moved. You would crave the relief of a world where danger was distant, where you could let your guard down without consequence. But that world did not exist here. This was a place where vigilance was survival, and survival was the only currency that truly mattered. And so, as the day unfolded and the sun climbed high, you would see that life among the Vikings was not a series of isolated trials. It was a single, unbroken challenge, physical, mental, emotional, woven into every breath you took. To endure it was to shape yourself into something harder, sharper, and more unyielding than you had ever been. To fail was simply to disappear, leaving behind only the faint echo of your name in someone else's saga. By midday, the sun low, even at its highest point, cast a thin, pale light over the settlement, and the air carried the mingled scents of salt, wood smoke, and labor. This was the Viking world in its full motion, when every person, young and old, was locked into the rhythm of survival. If the morning had been about preparing and beginning the work, the middle of the day was about endurance. Meals were brief, practical affairs, no long breaks, no lingering over conversation unless the task allowed it. Bread baked earlier was torn by hand, eaten with cured fish or cheese, maybe a thin stew if the household was fortunate that day. You might imagine this as a time for comfort, but there was no comfort in the sense you know it. The hearth was not for lounging. It was for cooking, drying wet gear, or keeping tools workable in the cold. If you sat too long without purpose, someone would notice. And if someone noticed, they might speak, and their words could cut deeper than any blade. In the Viking mind, idleness was more than laziness. It was dishonor, a flaw in your character that reflected poorly on your family and your name. The tasks themselves were relentless. In the summer months, you might be out in the fields, scything hay under the unshaded glare of the sun, hands blistering on the wooden handles of your tools. In the winter, you might be mending nets, so worn they seemed ready to crumble, your fingers stiff from cold even as the fire burned nearby. The sea called some away for fishing or trade, while others worked on shaping wood for ship repairs or carving beams for new buildings. Each task had a pace that could not be rushed but could never be allowed to slow. To you, it might feel like there was no space to breathe. To them, this was breathing. It was life. And around all of it, there was the constant noise of the community voices calling for tools. Children shouting as they carried buckets of water. The thud of an axe striking wood. The low hum of songs used to pace the work. Even the animals were part of the soundtrack. The lowing of cattle, the bleating of goats, the bark of dogs that guarded the settlement. These sounds were not distractions. They were reassurance that the village was alive, that the work was being done, that survival was being secured. Yet beneath the routine, there was always the readiness for the sudden call. You could be in the middle of stacking firewood when someone shouted that a sail had been spotted on the horizon, friend or foe. No one would know until the ship was close enough to read. Or perhaps a runner arrived from a neighboring settlement with word of sickness, of strangers moving through the forest, of an animal killing livestock. At such news, everything could change in moments. The men might arm themselves, the women and children might be moved to safer ground. Supplies could be gathered for a quick journey. There was no such thing as an unshakable plan here. The day was always ready to split into two: the day you thought you were having and the day you were about to have. The harshness of this reality seeped into the very way people interacted. Conversations were, fettin' short and to the point. Words were used with care because they were remembered. If you promised something, it was not forgotten. And failure to keep that promise could cost you more than embarrassment. It could cost you alliances, protection, even your life. You would feel that weight each time you spoke, the understanding that casual remarks carried more gravity than you intended. You would also see that this constant vigilance bred a certain sharpness in people. They noticed everything: the way you carried yourself, the speed at which you completed a task, whether your eyes stayed steady when someone spoke to you. And when they noticed weakness, they remembered, not out of cruelty, but because in a place where survival depended on every member of the group, weakness was a risk that could not be ignored. For you, the strain would be exhausting. Even if your body could adapt to the cold, the heavy labor, and the long days, the mental weight of constant scrutiny might prove too much. You might begin to long for privacy, for a space where no one was watching, judging, or depending on you. But that space did not exist here. Privacy was rare and usually only came in moments when you were gathering water alone at the stream, or when you rose before everyone else to step outside and breathe the icy morning air. Even then, you were never truly unseen. The land itself felt like it was watching. The vast open sky, the endless sea, the dark, thick forests that seemed to lean inward as you passed. You were part of something larger than yourself, and in the Viking world, that meant you carried both the weight of your own survival and the shared burden of the community. And so, as the day stretched on and the shadows lengthened, you would realize that the hardest part of living among the Vikings was not the cold, not the labor, not even the danger. It was the unyielding demand to always be ready, to always give more, to always stand without showing fear. That was the true test. And it was one you could not put aside for even a single heartbeat. As evening crept across the settlement, the light shifting from pale gold to the deep blues of a northern dusk, the pace did not slow. For the Vikings, the end of daylight was not the end of the day. It was a change in its nature. The outdoor labor might be finished, but the work simply moved indoors, into the smoky warmth of longhouses where shadows flickered across wooden beams and the air carried the mingled scents of food, animals, and people pressed together. Here, you would find a different kind of endurance being tested. Fires were stoked high to fight the chill that seeped in through the walls, and the glow painted every face in tones of amber and coal. Meals were served communally. Bowls of stew passed hand to hand, bread torn in thick chunks, mugs of ale or mead shared between neighbors. It might seem like a time for relaxation, but even here there were unspoken rules. Where you sat mattered. Who you spoke to mattered. The way you held yourself, the way you listened, the words you chose, they all reflected on you and your household. A careless comment could be remembered for months. A boast could inspire a challenge. An insult, even unintended, might fester until it erupted into something far more dangerous. This was a world where honor was not a vague concept but a living currency, and it was measured every day in every interaction. Around the fire, stories were told of voyages to distant lands, of battles fought and won, of ancestors whose names still carried weight. These were not idle entertainments. They were cultural memory, shaping how people saw themselves and their place in the world. If you were invited to speak, you would be expected to hold your own, to tell something worth hearing, to speak with clarity and strength. Failing to do so would not just embarrass you, it would lower the respect your household commanded. And yet, these gatherings were not all tension. There was laughter too, the sharp kind that came from people who knew hardship intimately and valued joy because it was rare. Songs rose in voices roughened by weather and work, the rhythms keeping time with the pounding of mugs on the table. Children darted between legs, dodging hands that tried to catch them, until a sharp word from a parent sent them skidding to a stop. In quieter moments, the longhouse would fill with the sounds of weaving looms, the scrape of blades being sharpened, the low murmur of private conversation. And always, behind it all, there was the watch. Men and women took turns standing at the doors, peering into the dark beyond the firelight, listening for anything out of place. Danger could come at any time, and the Vikings never forgot that. You might think that the most difficult part of this life was the labor, the cold, the hunger, or the ever-present threat of violence. But by nightfall, you would begin to understand something deeper, that the true challenge was the constancy of it. There was no moment, no hour, when you were not accountable, when your place in the group was not being affirmed or eroded by your actions. Fatigue could betray you as easily as fear. A slip in your words, a missed signal in someone's tone, a failure to respond to a subtle challenge, any of these could have consequences that reached far beyond that single night. As the fire burned low and people began to settle, some sleeping in the longhouse, others retreating to smaller outbuildings, you might finally lay down on a bed of furs and straw. The warmth of the fire would fade slowly, the scent of smoke lingering in your clothes and hair. You might close your eyes, thinking you could rest, but the sounds would remain breathing. Shifting bodies, the faint howl of wind outside, the creak of wood as the structure settled. Sleep, when it came, would be light. The slightest noise could wake you, and if it did, you would lie still, listening, trying to decide if what you heard was harmless, a dog moving in its sleep, or a sign of something worse. You would realize that this was not a place where you could ever truly let your guard down. Even in safety, you prepared for danger. Even in rest, you were ready to rise. By dawn, when the first pale light crept in through the cracks in the walls, you would already feel the weight of the day ahead pressing down on you. The cold air would sting your face, your muscles would ache from the day before, and yet there would be no thought of stopping. Around you, the Vikings would rise without complaint, moving into the next day with the same unyielding rhythm as before. And in that moment, you would understand fully why you would not last a single day among them, not because you lacked strength or skill, but because their endurance was not a matter of hours or tasks. It was a way of being, forged by the land, the sea, and the constant presence of risk. It was a life where every breath, every action, every word was part of the unbroken chain that bound the living to survival. And survival here was not something you achieved once. It was something you proved again and again, every day you were alive.